he's not going to be just here for today. He's going to be with us the rest of the time, and after that, he's going to come with me to Haiti. So in the meantime, welcome, Mr. Evans.
We were asked to make friends, all right? And we were going to be given an opportunity to share 3 things about our new best friend. And that opportunity was denied. So I am creating my own opportunity now. And my new best friend, Eric, sorry, not Eric, what am I saying? John. John Crawford is going to say 3 things about me, which I hope will show how much we share.
Thank you. Hi, I'm John Crawford, part of the Charlotte contingent in support of Team Zambia. And there are 3 unique connections that Evans and I have after we've had a chance to talk. The first is that we are both in a brotherhood of adoptive fathers of children from Africa. Evans has adopted a daughter, his princess, from South Africa. I've adopted a son from Uganda. The second thing that we hold in common is we have a deep respect for Chuck Colson, who is founder of Prison Ministries International. He is a man that I've done a lot of reading of his work, and Evans has spent a fair amount of time with him before he passed away. God rest his soul. The third issue is involving medicine. We have a unique connection. I'm a family physician in the States, and Evans is married to an ophthalmologist, an eye specialist, and an eye surgeon. So immediately when we were talking and chatting, we found a number of things that made us kindred spirits.
Wow.
Thank you, brother.
Evans, may I have one more thing?
Yes.
That beautiful shirt that he's wearing, the South Sudanese refugee single moms made. I just want I want them to think of that.
Yeah, if I were to join one group here, I probably would have a bias for South Sudan. This is going to be a very exciting time, you know, because anyone who has asked me to sing will tell you that I'm always off key. So if I'm going to be the keynote speaker, God help you, all right?
Is this unusual?
Business exactly, yeah. Okay, maybe just quickly before I start talking about the state of microfinance in Africa, I just want to mention that for me, microfinance is not a science. You know, some people call it a social science. For me, I call it a spiritual experience. The reason is very simple. You know, when I was still teaching at the University of Zimbabwe, I did not even have a clue that one day I was going to be involved in microfinance. I was sitting in my office one morning, and one of my students just knocked on my door, walked into the office, and said something that was completely prophetic. You know, she said to me, "Sir, you know, the Lord spoke to me last night and told me something about you." And I said, "What would that be?" You know, if you are teaching students, you don't know exactly what the Lord said to them. Maybe He said that you should let them pass even though they're not doing well. But then I listened intently, and she said to me, the Lord said to give me Isaiah 58 and verse 12 for you. Right? And I will just read it very quickly, if I can find it. Isaiah 58 verse 12 says, "And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. I mean, to tell you the truth, I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. And exactly 3 years later, I found myself setting up one of the first microfinance institutions in Zimbabwe. And after that time, I never found my way back, to teaching at the University of Zimbabwe. So for me, my involvement in microfinance was a spiritual experience. And even though it involved what a lot of people would consider to be carnal, finance, carnal money, it actually is representative of what the Lord has called me to do through Isaiah 58 and verse 12. So, the way I would like to present this talk this morning will be a little different from what normal keynote addresses are like. I will be talking with you. I will not be, talking to you. I'll be talking with you. I will not make a very technical presentation. I'll be talking naturally. The microfinance, as we understand it today, actually was established, if you like, by Mohammed Yunus, of Bangladesh in the 1970s. And when he designed microfinance, he actually based it on 12, principles. And I'm not going to go through the 12 principles. You can find them on the internet. But, there were 2 critical offerings in microfinance. And these were credit and savings. The way he designed microfinance was that you can never offer credit without savings. That was very, very important. Of course, he talked about many other things, like I said, 12 principles. Now, however, in the 1980s, microfinance, or Mohammed Yunus used to call it microcredit. Microfinance actually microcredit took a new form. And the form was what was, known as the financial systems approach. And this was mainly promoted by 2 microfinance experts. That is Elizabeth Ryan, some of you would know her from the US, and Maria Otero. And in 1991, in particular, they came out with a paper that defined, if you like, microfinance. And, this was, in a sense, taken up by SIGEP, the consultative group against poverty, that was housed within the World Bank. And they actually defined microfinance as a movement that envisions a world in which low-income households have permanent access to a range of high-quality and affordable financial services offered by a range of retail providers to finance income-producing activities, build assets, stabilize consumption, and protect against risks. These services include savings, credit, insurance, remittances, and payments, and others. Now, there are a few things that were very interesting that came out of the financial systems approach. And those were, first of all, for the first time, consumption lending became a core component of lending to the poor. Because Mohammed Yunus was only talking about lending only for enterprise development purposes. And it was the savings component that was responsible for looking at consumption issues and emergency issues. But for the first time, in the 1980s, late 1980s and early 1990s, consumption became a core component of lending to the poor. Secondly, the focus shifted away from poverty alleviation to provision of a range of financial services. And of course, a lot of people now would refer to that as financial inclusion. All right? And then the savings diminished in value, unfortunately, because the lenders began to look at making profits from high interest and fee charges. Because once you move away from your original intention, you can actually drift to something that maybe would work against what you originally intended, to do. And then, of course, organizing savings became a very tedious process, particularly because a lot of lenders, particularly the NGOs, were not licensed to take, deposits. Now, but let's look at there are three different options for microfinance that exist, today. I mean, there may be 4, there may be 5, there may be many more. But I have chosen to concentrate on 3 key ones or main ones. The first one is what I look at as poverty alleviation focus. And if you look at the poverty alleviation focus, you'll see that it actually has interventions that go well beyond just providing, credit to households. It also includes other, support principles like women empowerment, particularly in Africa. We know exactly the position of women, and I was so excited, this morning as we went through the devotions to show that, from Christ's perspective, women carry the same weight and integrity as men. So in Africa, this is something that, has taken time, to be realized. And so some of the poverty alleviation, the focuses of microfinance are really designed to empower women. They are designed to actually create, if you like, a savings discipline, among poor communities, actually bringing back what Mohammed Yunus, originally intended to see within microcredit. And of course, providing certain services that enable, particularly women, to do other things other than just care, for their children at home. Like daycare and nutritional, education. There are some health initiatives as well. And I know that in Uganda, I'm sure Patrick, you'll be aware, some of your partners within Uganda actually, had microfinance initiatives that included, setting up daycare, clinics, and also, education to help people prevent contraction, of HIV/AIDS and the related. The second, focus is what I call the micro-enterprise development focus. And this focus, in a sense, is narrower than the poverty alleviation focus. And this, looks at strengthening, micro-enterprises. And it is really concentrating on what was known some time back as the minimalist approach, where you offer credit only to support enterprise development. And those institutions that were focusing on micro-enterprise development were, focused also on reaching self-sufficiency, because they did not spend a lot of money on other issues other than just concentrating on credit, for enterprise development purposes. And then, of course, the final focus that I want to look at is what we call the microfinance focus, which was about financial inclusion. And financial inclusion is what, Elizabeth Ryan and Maria Otero actually advocated in the financial systems approach in the 1990s. And basically, it includes, the savings, credit, payments or remittances, insurance, and all the services, that can be grouped under, financial services. And, the argument there is that the poor are like everybody else, and they need financial services that are more diverse than just credit, for enterprise development purposes. Okay. Now, what are we doing, in this work? What exactly, do we do? Who do we serve, and how do we serve them? I have looked at 2, categories. The first category being the survivalist enterprises, and I'll explain what that means, and what I call the larger micro enterprises. The survivalist enterprises are actually, the tiniest micro enterprises that we serve, in this room. And these are enterprises or entrepreneurs, if you like, that fall short of minimum income standards, and that are expected for families that are living above the poverty line. And I know that we like talking about serving people, whose incomes are less than, or people that live on less than $1 per day. At one time, I actually heard that, that had been raised to less than $2 per day. So those would fall under survivalist, enterprises, and they hardly invest what we call meaningful capital in their businesses. And so they require capital from as little as $50, sometimes even less than $50, up to about $800. And then, these are typically organized in women's groups. And I know that for most of you here, you actually work with women in groups. And the majority of those women have not quite completed high school. Some of them have been to school, maybe up to primary level. Some of them have not even been to school at all, and they're just struggling to feed their families. And they normally would not own smartphones. I mean, I need to be very careful here. Around 2010, 2011, there were fewer people that had, cell phones. But now there are a lot more people with cell phones. But most of the people that are served under the survivalist, enterprises do not own smartphones. They have normal, what do you call them? I'm trying to find the right term to describe, just a cell phone that can call, what is it? Flip phones, yeah. That can call, that can SMS, and can use the SSD, facility, but not, what younger people are using these days. And in a sense, most of the survivalist entrepreneurs will use the profits or the earnings from their enterprises as the sole source of household incomes. And they will use that income to support their families, their children, to have a roof over their heads, to have at least 2 or 3 meals a day, to have coverings for their bodies, and maybe to afford even Panadol, if someone has a headache. But most of their efforts are focused on taking care of the basic needs of the family. But then when you come to the larger micro enterprises, you'll find that some of these are mainly concentrated in urban areas. They require larger loans than those that survivalists require. And there are cases where some of your larger micro-enterprise clients have required up to $5,000. And studies have shown that the larger micro-enterprises are male-dominated, and most of the people that are running them have completed high school. It doesn't mean that all of them have, but the majority of them have completed high school, mainly because the larger micro-enterprises call for better management skills. First of all, most of the micro-entrepreneurs that come to us looking for loans cannot afford security or collateral that is required by commercial lenders. And so they cannot access funding from banks because of that. Secondly, even if they were to approach commercial lenders or commercial banks for funding, those commercial banks struggle to assess the viability of those businesses, mainly because of information asymmetries. There's no information that banks can rely on to actually evaluate your ability to repay the loan that you're borrowing. And then, of course, it talks about the absence of credit records. And then, because of the information asymmetries as well, the cost of lending becomes very, very high. Because, you basically have to recreate, if you like, the financial records, or create financial records for those micro-enterprises, for you to be able to actually have an objective or a scientific evaluation of, their strength and ability to sustain and meet the loan obligations that they are seeking. And then, of course, in some countries, the support to micro-enterprises goes with mentoring. But mentoring is very, very expensive because it involves training, it involves other business support services that need to be paid for, but unfortunately are not productive from a financial point of view. And most of the micro-enterprises that are being supported are not in a position to pay for the services that would strengthen their businesses. Okay. Now, one thing that I need you guys to understand, and this may have been a little different, in the 80s and 90s, is that, microfinance now has become very competitive. You can no longer sit back and relax and say, oh, well, we are the only ones who are providing this service. And when we talk to donors, donors will come and give us the money because we are the only conduit, to the financial freedom for those that come from the poor economies. There are now diverse institutions that offer microfinance. Now, I know that earlier on I talked about banks struggling to, if you like, assess micro-enterprise loan requests. But remember, micro-enterprise development has existed since the 1970s. And a lot of information has actually been produced. And a lot of methodologies and practices have been developed. And a lot of financial institutions, particularly from the 90s, when the World Bank promoted what they call commercial microfinance, have actually studied microfinance, studied what makes micro-enterprises tick. And so they've come up with models that they've tried out. Of course, some have failed, some have succeeded. But basically what we need to know is that now we are no longer the only ones that are involved in micro-enterprise development. The industry has become very diverse. There are now banks that are involved. They are what we call the non-bank financial intermediaries. They are not really banks, but they are not NGOs. They are commercial micro-enterprise companies that focus on commercial microfinance, particularly the financial inclusion part. And then, of course, you've got NGOs, like most of us are here, and then you've got credit unions and cooperatives. Some of these actually were there even before Mohammed Yunus started talking about micro-enterprise development. And these have been mobilizing savings and have been rotating those savings as loans only to their members. And I've got a table here from the Mixed Microfinance World website, that actually looks at sub-Saharan microfinance analysis and benchmarking. And this report actually came out in 2010 and 2011. And it only focused on about 8% of the existing, microfinance intermediaries, in sub-Saharan Africa. But, you can see, the different activities among the banks, credit unions, the non-banking financial institutions, as well as the NGOs. And you can see that 21,582,000, if you like, clients actually benefited from these financial service providers. And of course, these were split between borrowings as well as deposits or savings. And we will talk a little more about the distinction between savings and the deposits as part of the microfinance activities that are going on in Africa. And some of you will actually be shocked to see the trends, particularly between the competition between the savings and the credit. Now let's look at a few key trends in microfinance. First of all, we need to understand that commercial microfinance is growing. And there are so many reasons why commercial microfinance is growing in Africa. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But first of all, we know that in Africa there are fewer banking financial institutions, right? Than, if you like, the NGOs. But the growth of the non-banking financial institutions is faster than the growth of the non-governmental organizations. And in 2010, 2011, 57% of the new microfinance institutions were actually the non-banking financial institutions, right? And this shows that commercial microfinance is actually growing faster than the NGO-sponsored microfinance, right? And then in the same year, the non-banking financial institutions provided 70% of the total gross loan book, right? And 71% of total deposits, in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, the banks, the non-financial banking institutions and the banks, together, of course, provided the 70% of the total gross loan book and 71% of the deposits. But of that amount, 53%, of the gross loan book came from the banks, with 60%, representing the deposits. Right? I know that some of these numbers are, very confusing, but what you need to understand here is that, commercial microfinance is growing. It's actually growing faster than the NGO microfinance activities. And the reasons are clearly because, commercial microfinance, goes with, deposits. And the deposits are being utilized in order to fund credit. And because the deposits are cheaper than borrowings, they find that the resources, for on lending become more as you practice commercial microfinance than if you're practicing NGO microfinance, where you have to rely on donors and their capacity to fund the growth of the loan. Right? Now, 1/3 of microfinance service providers have become large-scale providers. This actually says that it's not very easy to grow your activities to scale that can be considered to be large. It's not very easy. It's very, very difficult because there are a lot of things that need to be put in place, and we'll be talking about those towards the end of this presentation. But the large-scale providers, being 1/3 of the total providers in sub-Saharan Africa, accounted for 85% of all borrowers, and depositors. So if 1/3 of the providers account for over 85%, of the activities, then you can tell that the small ones are really small, because they account for only 15% of all microenterprise activity. And then thirdly, there are more deposits than borrowers. In other words, in sub-Saharan Africa, when you look at microfinance, from a financial inclusion point of view, you will see that there are more savers than borrowers. And I think traditionally we used to think that everybody wanted to borrow. And we thought that credit was actually more important than savings. But when you look at the statistics, you will see that the opposite is true. There is need for more savings facilities than there are for credit facilities. And the trend, for savings is actually upward. And this is mainly driven by the cooperatives. Because cooperatives are really, made up of savers. And the credit that goes out of the cooperatives, is from the savings. So, naturally, the savings have to be more than the credit, because you cannot lend out more than you have. Okay? And then approximately 21.6 million deposit. There are approximately 21.6 million depositors in sub-Saharan Africa versus only 7.8 million borrowers. So the ratio is 3:1. And these were the statistics in 2011. So now the NBFIs and the NGOs offer mainly micro-enterprise loans. Now this is very important. I want you to hear me. Because when we talk about microfinance providers in sub-Saharan Africa, we are not just talking about the NGOs. We are talking about, the diverse, form of providers that I talked about earlier on. You need to understand that, there are different levels of offerings, by different categories of providers. So the NBFIs and the NGOs offer mainly micro-enterprise loans, and 85 to 95% of their services comprise credit offering. All right? And then when you look at the banks and the cooperatives, these actually offer more of consumption loans than enterprise credit. And they believe that consumption loans, are easier, to offer because they are normally backed by, salaries. Okay? So the risk is lower and the yield is higher. And most of them are very short term, but with high, interest and fees. Also, because the banks and the cooperatives are licensed to take deposits, they do have a lot of money that is available to them, at very low interest. And so they can actually mobilize that money, and give it out as short-term consumption loans. All right? Another thing that you need to be aware of. First of all, sub-Saharan governments are developing more interest in microfinance. Why? That's exactly what you're talking about. Why are sub-Saharan governments developing more interest in microfinance? Interestingly, it's because over the years, it has been proven that microfinance is one of many, and very importantly, one of many components that are needed to reduce poverty in depressed communities. Now, I am careful to say one of many, because traditionally, everybody thought microfinance was the full panacea, for treating poverty. That is not the case. Microfinance is one of many. But it's also been proven that there's a direct link between microfinance and development effectiveness. Of course, through the reduction of poverty and increasing assets of the majority of the people it serves. Now, a word of caution here. If we offer microfinance for the sake of offering microfinance, we miss the point. We offer microfinance services so that the poor can create assets or build assets. Now, going back to what Professor Jonas said in the 1970s, that you cannot give credit without complementing the credit with savings. What he was saying was that credit must give you the ability to build resources that will enable you to build your assets. Unfortunately, with the market approach to microfinance, that was lost. And then institutions existed more to make money than to actually intervene in poor communities to build assets in those poor communities. And a lot of people started talking about, microfinance institutions, particularly what we call MFIs, needing to be sustainable. And then they forgot to actually say what that sustainability was. Because for them, they say charge as much as you can, give as many loans as you can, so that you can be financially sustainable. Financially sustainable to do what? So financially sustainable to pay salaries and make people rich, particularly because they were talking about, commercial microfinance. They started, having investors in microfinance institutions. And a lot of the traditional microfinance institutions moved away from their poverty alleviation focus to the microfinance focus, and then they moved on to become banks. I'm not going to mention names, but Kenya knows of so many microfinance institutions that started as poverty alleviation focused institutions and ended up being microfinance banks, ended up abandoning their targeted constituencies and started dealing with only those that actually did not need to be assisted as being the drivers for their profitability. In South Africa, some of the microfinance institutions became banks, and some of the shareholders of those banks have become multi-trillionaires in rand terms, of course, because of this microfinance stake. So we need to be very, very careful that the link between the microfinance and development effectiveness through the reduction of poverty and increasing of assets is not lost in what we do. Right. And then, of course, it's been proven also that microfinance, in order for microfinance to work effectively, it should be part of a comprehensive policy that includes education, development of infrastructure, decent housing, healthcare, so on and so forth. All right? And of course, in December 2009, the African Ministers of Economy and Finance recommended the adoption of a number of principles. And some of these were, they needed to adopt key principles for microfinance. Now, we're talking about regulation. Government was beginning to say, all right, we've seen that this is an important industry and we want to be involved. And we'll talk about the pros and the cons of that involvement. They also recommended fostering an enabling policy and regulatory environment, right? For microfinance that balances increased access for poor people, financial stability, and consumer protection, right? And then they recommended the promotion of standards and benchmarks for microfinance, supporting research, training, and capacity building. And some countries have actually appointed ministers of microfinance, just like that. And Senegal and Benin are good examples of that. In South Africa, of course, the government has a dedicated microfinance fund, and I am part of that fund because I manage the South African government microfinance fund. And many other countries in East and West Africa in particular, have microfinance regulatory authorities. Actually, if I'm not wrong, in 2011, only 3 African countries that had microfinance activities did not have regulation, but every other country, started talking about regulation. And then, of course, the interest by the national governments lead to, let's look at the cons first very quickly. And I know that my time seems to be flying past, but the cons are that the microfinance agenda has been taken over by government. And so most of the funds flow to microfinance institutions is through bilateral agreements which are now subject to government corruption. And I don't have to explain what corruption is from an African government point of view. And maybe not just African, I think there's corruption everywhere, but it's very graphic in some of our African countries. And then, of course, because government gets too excited and becomes too political, they normally would come up with ambitious national strategies that are completely unachievable. And of course, failing to achieve some of those strategies leads to the discrediting of microfinance. In 2006, the South African government actually declared that microfinance does not work in South Africa because a number of greedy, commercialized microfinance institutions collapsed, and over 20 billion rand was actually lost, because of the failure of those institutions. And then we know that it's not only South Africa that has suffered that. In Africa, there are quite a number of other countries that have actually struggled to build their microfinance facilities. And then, of course, they've come up with stricter microfinance regulations. Like for instance, when you talk about interest rate caps, and I'm not saying that people should charge whatever they want to charge, but one of the biggest complaints or criticisms we have of the South African government is that it came up with what we call the National Credit Act that actually regulates how much microfinance institutions can charge on their loans. And the interest rate caps were done arbitrarily. There was no research that was done in order to look at what is the cost of delivering the microfinance. And so there's no correlation to the cost of providing the service and the earnings that you can get in order to cover those costs. And so, and I understand that in Kenya as well, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, Kenya also imposed some interest rate caps, and that actually almost decimated the digital credit offering industry. So those are some of the challenges that we face when the government starts getting involved in what you do. Of course, the pros are consumer protection legislation, which is very, very necessary, because this protects, if you like, the consumers against unfair practices, over-indebtedness, lack of transparency in pricing, and the promoting recourse mechanisms to address complaints and resolve conflicts or disputes. Let's look at the performance very quickly, and I think I've got about 3 or 4 more slides, and then I'll be done. But the performance of African microfinance providers, from a growth perspective, since the 2008-2009 World Economic Recession, it's been a little tough, for microfinance institutions in Africa. So they have not really grown as well as one would like to see them grow. The large-scale providers have seen the growth in the number of borrowers, but interestingly, the gross loan portfolio has actually declined. More numbers, but less, portfolio size. Why? Because the people that are coming in are mainly new people, not old people, but some of those people, are now subjected to smaller loans because of risk
issues, as well as the availability of new capital for funding purposes. And let me talk about the financial performance quickly so you'll understand why while the numbers are growing, the portfolio is declining. The financial performance has not been great, particularly in East and Southern Africa. The returns have been falling, due to the difficulties to recover, loans from clients, especially from the banks. I talked about the collapse of the South African microfinance, sector, because, well, I call it greed, but a lot of institutions that had offered money could not recover, because of the recession. Most of those banks had offered, consumer loans. And because of the recession, a lot of people lost their jobs, retrenchments and closure of companies and stuff like that. And so a lot of money was lost. And because of that, banks couldn't recover the money. So the financial crisis caused, banks to lose a lot of money. And the returns that they were enjoying before the recession, started declining, exponentially. And then, of course, the high transaction costs that, are associated with high lending risks. Because people were not paying, there was a lot of money that was invested in monitoring and follow-up, delinquency management and stuff like that. And so that ate into the, profits that, the providers were making. And then, of course, that all resulted in a steady rise in portfolio at risk. And actually, if you look at the portfolio at risk in Africa, it is
highest compared to everywhere else in the world. And the reason why the portfolio at risk is highest, and you'll see that the portfolio at risk over 30 days in Africa generally climbed above 5%, which is the world average, and in some cases went as far up as 15%. But this was because of the high staff expenses, that are caused by low-level skills being available, and forcing the institutions to actually source skills from outside of the continent, and those skills are very expensive, they don't come cheap at all. And of course the high transaction costs in the rural areas. Most of you operate in the rural areas, and for you to be able to mobilize 1,000 people, you have to talk to about 1,000 people, and each one of them requiring at least let's say an hour or two. And when I used to practice microfinance, I would go to a village, and you Africans will understand what I'm talking about. And I had to be culturally sensitive. And if I was talking to someone like an elderly, grandmother who needed a loan from me, I couldn't just go to her and say, all right, how much do you need? What do you do? How do you do it? And is this viable or not? And then just make a decision and go away. I would actually sit down and greet her and talk about, her grandchildren, find out how they're doing, try to find out where all, her children are, why she's looking after the grandchildren, and whether they go to school, what the prospects are. And after only 40 minutes do I start talking about the loan. So if you look at the time that I invest in just trying to get one loan of $30, you will see that at the end of the day, the $30 loan, that will probably give me $3 in returns, actually cost me about $70. So that's why operating in rural areas can be very expensive. And when programs come to donors and say, hey, we really need money in order to operate effectively in the rural areas, these are the realities of operating there. And if you ignore the cultural issues, you will never be able to help or assist the people in those areas. And now, of course, high costs of managing savings, particularly because a lot of NGOs cannot take deposits directly. They have to actually use third parties to monitor the savings that are deposited through third-party institutions like banks. And then, of course, the monetary costs I've already talked about, a growing portfolio at risk and monitoring, and just traveling from one person to the other 3-4 times before they can pay back your $30 loan. And then, of course, the advantage in Africa is that the financial expenses are much lower than experienced elsewhere in the world, and this is because a lot of, like I said, 85% of the providers in Africa, are banks and non-financial, banking institutions, some of which are able to mobilize deposits, cheap sources of funding, and so that lowers, if you like, the financial expenses. When we talk about financial expenses, we are talking about the cost of, the financing, capital. And then, of course, there are a lot of concessionary loans that are made available. In South Africa, for instance, our institution has changed a bit now, but traditionally we have offered very low-cost wholesale funds to microfinance institutions. And some of those wholesale funds are accompanied by grants also that further subsidize the cost of providing the loans. And then, of course, I've talked about the portfolio risk rising up to 15%, because of the poor or low skills. And I think one other very important thing, and this probably most of you will relate to, one of the challenges that we have in terms of effectively following up our loans is because we do not have good systems. Our loan tracking systems are very compromised, because we can't afford the very expensive, state-of-the-art, real-time, monitoring systems. And then What can we learn, from successful networks, worldwide? Very quickly, maybe I'll talk more about this tomorrow when we talk about, perceptions, what we can do. But basically, there are certain specific things, or certain general things that we cannot ignore, like, solid human capital development, effective systems development, community surveys. We need to understand our clients. A lot of people thought that microfinance was, right, I've got money and I can walk into a community and say, whoever needs money, I'll give you money. We did not understand, for instance, that savings were more important than credit. We thought that credit was more important than savings. But when you engage people, engage communities, then you can tell what exactly their needs are. And then you interact with them according to the needs that they have. We need to find ways of handling the operational shortfalls. We need to have a significant proportion of on-lending funds, instead of spending a lot of money on salaries. We'll talk about that later. I don't want to upset anybody for now. We have to diversify our product offerings, and we have to think about systems and their automation, and then financial structuring becomes very, very important. We'll talk about this more tomorrow. But just in closing, I would like you to be aware that in Africa, microfinance in Africa is changing. Apart from commercial loans, commercial microfinance becoming more and more prevalent, we actually have what we call, the new digital revolution. So digital credit is growing, especially in East Africa. Actually, Kenya was among the first in the world, to offer digital credit. Tanzania is one of those early ones as well, but it came after Kenya. And there are a lot of other African countries that are beginning to get into digital credit. And basically, digital credit is offering credit, using the mobile phones. Not necessarily smartphones, because some of them use SSD, facilities, whatever that means, don't ask me. And but these loans are very small, short term, usually between $30 and $50, and offered for short term, over 4 weeks. And the digital credit, the strength of digital credit is that, it's instant credit, there's no waiting time. The credit decisions are very automated, and the disbursement and the repayment of loans, is done remotely, through the smartphones or through direct, deposits from the bank. And these eliminate human intervention, and they normally take the form of partnerships with mobile phone companies, obviously, because the cell phone or the mobile phone is the medium of loan offering. We need to really decide whether we want to be in consumer lending or in enterprise lending. So before you actually think of embarking on digital credit, you need to understand how that works. And of course, the experiences in Kenya and Tanzania especially have proven that the defaults and or late payments are quite high, in digital credit. So digital credit is not the solution that everybody thought it would be. And so there is more regulatory work that is work and research that is required. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Regarding competition, have you seen successful competitive strategies to compete with the larger organizations? All right, this is very, very interesting. One of the biggest criticisms that I have for microfinance, particularly in Africa, is that very few microfinance institutions actually have their own, if you like, ethos when it comes to microfinance. Most of the African microfinance institutions actually come out of microfinance movements from outside of Africa. Now, if you look at some of the big movements like Opportunity International, for instance, based in Chicago, Opportunity International, has had a serious, huge, significant impact on microfinance worldwide. and also in Africa. And there are a number of microfinance institutions that have become banks, and they are known as opportunity banks, around Africa. So when you talk about competitive, strategies, that competitive edge that those microfinance institutions have in Africa is actually engineered from, the mother body that is outside of Africa. And the sad part of the competitiveness here is that the competitiveness has been based not necessarily on how, to deliver the needs to poor communities, but more on who has the capacity to raise more funding, to put into those microfinance institutions. So, for you to be competitive, for you to succeed, you need to be affiliated. You don't need to be, but you need to be affiliated with networks that have the ability, to raise funding for you to do what you need to do. You need to be affiliated with networks that have the capacity to do research and understand, what is happening globally and what the winning formulas are. I'm trying to remember a certain expression that I heard from John Maxwell, I think earlier on, late last year, about how to win. It's almost like you need to know more before. All right? Because now what happens is, if anybody comes up with an innovation, literally within months, everybody else has caught on to that innovation, and they're doing exactly that. So for you to stay ahead, you've got to know more before. You've got to be the first one to know more, and once you've known more before, you exploit that knowledge, the before knowledge before other people, get onto it. So I know that the battle has been, among the big networks like Opportunity International, like Finca, like BRAC, all those international networks that are involved in microfinance, in Africa. East Africa, I think, has done well when it comes to microfinance, much better than Southern Africa has. If the purpose of MFI is to help the poor build assets, what are some practical ways for us to measure the success and impact of our MFI goals? Our weakness has been to measure our success by how many people we have given loans to and how profitable we have become as an institution. One thing I learned in 2013 was to stop thinking institutional and start thinking end user. Right? End user, I'm talking about the client. And for us to really know how to measure our success, we really need to understand, first of all, who our client is, where they are at before we start working with them, and how we move along with them as we support them, and what they look like, years after we have supported them. People talk about PPI, that. We can talk about that, but basically, put simply, we need to have, baseline surveys. Understand exactly where people are at before we start working with them. Instead of rushing in there and doing whatever we want to do, and then trying to think where we started with the people after we've completed what we're doing. So we have to understand who we are working with before we start working with them, where they are at, and then of course, we need to make sure that what we do working with them has to do with the need that they have. And then we need to, after working with them, sit back and look back and say, did we understand what they needed? Did we do what they needed? Did we move them from where they were at? And did we take them to where they wanted to go to? That is the only way we can actually measure the success of what we're doing.
As you said earlier, there's a lot of critique about microfinance, not only in other parts of the world, but also in Africa. I wanted to hear from you, Rim, if there are great success stories that we can draw on from the continent of Africa. You did mention East Africa. has done very well, but we don't know the details. Rather, you have told us earlier how South Africa failed, and the government moved almost to closing it down. We would really be interested to know really success stories in Africa, and which models were used to arrive to those success stories. You did mention things which are very interesting to me. I mean, I'm just looking at them, things to do with interest rates, things to do with sustainability, and then of course meeting the cost of operation, and then building assets. I was asking myself, how do we strike the balance? I mean, in between these delicate areas, on one hand we want sustainability, and then we also want to do our operations, build assets, and then there's an issue of interest rates here. I mean,
you know, it's very difficult to actually identify stories in Africa to say these are really success stories. The reason being that we have measured success wrongly, like I said earlier on, because we've been looking at institutions, we've been looking at how the institutions have fared, we've looked at how the different networks have been able to raise funding, how much money has been poured into the poor communities without looking at how that money has transformed the lives of those communities. So what I would say is that there have been a lot of success stories when it comes to institutional successes, but there have been very few researches done on what those institutions have actually done on the ground. All right, so it's very difficult to actually say this is a good success story. So I will be very honest and say, it's very difficult for me to actually think of a real success story right now, apart from looking at institutional successes. In terms of balancing the cost, all right, of delivering the service and the benefits that come out of that cost, as well as the funding, the sources of funding for those services. It's really a question of what philosophy you hold for microfinance. And I have tried to stay away from telling you what I really believe in. Really believe in. One of the biggest challenges that I have in the institution that I work with, like I said earlier on, we used to provide wholesale funding that was accompanied by grant funding to subsidize the operational shortfalls. But of late, we now offer commercial loans, and we have withdrawn the subsidies that we give to the institutions. So one of the biggest struggles I have is to say,
how do the microfinance institutions working with the poor balance this delicate things? Thank you.
Okay, it's very difficult to actually identify stories in Africa to say these are really success stories. The reason being that we have measured success wrongly, like I said earlier on, because we've been looking at institutions, we've been looking at how the institutions have fared, we've looked at how the different networks have been able to raise funding, how much money has been poured into the poor communities without looking at how that money has transformed the lives of those communities. So what I would say is that there have been a lot of success stories when it comes to institutional successes, but there have been very few researches done on what those institutions have actually done on the ground. All right, so it's very difficult to actually say this is a good success story. So I will be very honest and say, it's very difficult for me to actually think of a real success story right now, apart from looking at institutional successes. In terms of balancing the cost, all right, of delivering the service and the benefits that come out of that cost, as well as the funding, the sources of funding for those services. You know, it's really a question of, you know, what philosophy you hold for microfinance. And I have tried to stay away from telling you what I really believe in. You know, really believe in. One of the biggest challenges that I have in the institution that I work with, like I said earlier on, we used to provide wholesale funding that was accompanied by grant funding to subsidize the operational, you know, shortfalls. But of late, we now offer commercial loans, and we have withdrawn the subsidies that we give, you know, to the institutions. What is microfinance? What is our philosophy? Maybe looking at the three philosophies that I talked about: poverty alleviation, enterprise development, and microfinance. Where do we really fit? And I always go back to the 1970s from, you know, Professor Yunus, and say maybe that man actually had a vision that many people have lost now. Now, the vision was a good vision, but it needed partners to actually make sure it happens. Now, the question is, if you change your vision from the 70s to the 90s, you basically are saying microfinance is a commercial science that must be funded commercially. And once you talk that way, the poor are out of the question.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Completely out of the question. And you might as well set up your bank there and do whatever you want to do. And a lot of networks or movements which started as poor, you know, institutions are now banks. Why? It was because of the pressure of raising the resources to continue doing what they were doing. And the question was, were they doing what they were doing for the good of the poor, or were they doing what they were doing because they were running businesses? So my philosophy is, go back to the 1970s. Make sure that you are operating within a world that is compassionate, which is why, for me, Christian microfinance is the best, you know, thing you can ever think of. You need to work in an environment that is caring, that is compassionate, an environment that is giving, an environment that actually says we want to give and not necessarily receive material, you know, financially, but we want to receive in terms of seeing the blessing of someone who could not take care of themselves now being able to take care of themselves. And I've said to the South African government that it is actually the responsibility of the state to fund microfinance, not the responsibility of commercial funders. So the state must actually make an allocation from taxpayers' funds because it carries the responsibility to ensure that there is development in the country. So for me, you know, the way, you know, microfinance happens generally is wrong. And when I talk about 85%, you know, of the microfinance activities coming from the banks and the non-bank financial institutions, it actually breaks my heart. Because it means that, you know, they are doing nothing but business. They are not in the, you know, responsibility of building poor communities, helping the poor build assets. They are in the process of actually transferring the, you know, non-existent resources from the poor, you know, to the coffers of the rich, you know, for their own purposes. That's me. I don't know if I've answered you. But
Yeah,
there are more questions. Sorry? More questions. Why are commercial microfinance enterprises doing better than NGO microfinance? All right. Whether they are doing better or not, I don't know. But yes, they are doing more, you know, because they are raising a lot of money through deposits. And they are raising, you know, they are charging commercial fees. And in reality, they are not supporting, they are not operating among the very poor, you know, people. They are actually operating among, you know, the larger micro enterprises in urban areas, you know, that, you know, have more access to resources than those that actually need the resources. So whether we call that, you know, more successful or doing better or not, I don't know. I do not advocate commercial microfinance, if you ask me, at all. So they can do whatever they want to do for me, they are not doing better. All right? Okay.
We have a question here.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, our learned presenter. I was wondering and thinking and questioning, we from Africa, what can we do to help Africa? I'm so glad to hear that through Microfinance program, you are giving a possibility to have finance, either to inject, to promote, to produce some kind of economy, so that an ordinary person out there should not live below poverty line. Look about up beyond, below it. Not even poverty, below it. What can we do? Is it the lack of finance? That's why things are like that. Maybe not. Look, I was there in primary school when Nigeria got independence. I saw the picture of bags of groundnut, peanut, live there, very highly developed country. I saw the products produced from Uganda being exported. I saw Kenya doing well in exporting these and other things. The capital of a nation, the economy of nations were high. But today, down the line, we are not talking of even microphone like this is never produced in Kenya. What is going on? Electronics, nothing. So how should we help Africa? Is it only because no money and we can borrow? And borrowing is a dangerous weapon. I borrow, I stay without paying back, then I want them to cancel the money borrowed. That is my thing. All right, how do we help Africa? Otherwise, thank you very much for presentation. You do not need to answer me. Think of these things.
No, I can respond very quickly. Business unusual. All right. I said earlier on that there is more need for savings than for credit. That is new thinking. All right. But let me explain something. There is something that is far more important than savings. Far more, credit does not even come to it. You know, a lot of our poor African communities are gifted. Somebody was asking, the secret, gifts that we have are very gifted. Now, when I travel abroad and I look at what my grandmother used to do for free by going to the riverbank and getting some reeds and weaving baskets and doing all sorts of things, I'm amazed at how much the basket costs in the US. You can actually sell one basket and come and buy a bicycle. And yet, my grandmother produced it at no cost at all. So what we need in Africa is, number one, we need to build viable partnerships with the Western world. And when I say viable partnerships, I'm talking about viable equal partnerships, not subservient, partnerships. In the sense that, if we can get the Western world to build some markets for some of the stuff that we produce in Africa, we don't have to necessarily produce, mobile phones, because the technology is already there. It is very cheap for those that are making it and will be very expensive for us. But we do have skills that are not privileged in the Western world, that we can actually exploit in order to build our communities and make our communities, producers or manufacturers or whatever you want to call them, and to export, to our Western partners. So, access to markets is one of the biggest things, which is much more important than savings, much more important than credit. The problem is that the mentality that we had as Africans when we started talking microfinance was, people need loans to do something. I have seen a lot of poor communities, being given money, to put into their businesses, and they produce a lot, and the things that just rot because nobody will buy them. And so they are not able to repay their loans, not because they don't want to, but because what they produced did not move at all. So, business unusual, we need to start incorporating, and we'll be talking about this tomorrow, right? We need to start incorporating, other diverse, support mechanisms for our communities, other than just giving loans and other than just, promoting savings.
But that's very excellent, but can that be done at micro level or macro level?
It can be done at micro
But
level.
then secondly,
Yeah.
of course you're aware, like many of us, that many of these initiatives have been tried even at macro levels. We had the AGOA, for example, and then we had the NEPAD and all this. And like you're saying, even there are a lot of complaints about that. So how do we make them better?
The heroes of microfinance are not the presidents of the African countries. The heroes of microfinances are in this room. All right? What I'm trying to say is that if, Patrick is running cafe, Patrick is the advocate of the poor people in Arua.
Yep.
And when he engages with peer servants and the friends of peer servants and Robert and everybody else, what he needs to talk about is not to say, guys, give us money to give more credit to poor people. What he needs to say is to say, hey, we have partnered with the JED program. They produce these beautiful shirts, and this is beautiful, believe me, this is beautiful, all right? They produce these beautiful shirts, and if you go to their stores, there are thousands of them that are sitting there not sold. But when tourists come to Uganda, they go to the market looking for these things. And then when they get back home, they wish they had bought more. But they are already back home. And they cannot buy more. Why not then say, okay, peer servants, can you talk to a textile company, whatever it is, or a departmental store that sells whatever, to come and buy in bulk. Take about 40, 50, 60, 100 different micro-entrepreneurs, put them together, they produce in bulk, and there are off-take agreements, and things are shipped to America. And if I forgot to buy a shirt in Africa, I can go to a store in America and buy what I needed to have bought, or I can go to the internet and buy from, buy online, some of this. Why could we do that? So Patrick is the one who should actually say, hey guys, yes, we may need money, but we have a lot of stuff that has been produced but is not moving. Buy it for us, or help us find people that will buy it. And then you will see that even your credit that you offer will become meaningful.